Today I will be doing a new instructional videos for the updated brake lines. There will be 3 videos showing you 3 ways of installing them on your rail cars and locomotives. In your beginner's pack of Magnalock brake lines you'll receive 20 pre-bent brass pieces of wire, 10 pairs of Magnalock brake lines, and 1 gluing jig and a straight piece of steel wire. In your standard package of high-performance Magnalock brake lines, you'll receive 20 pieces of pre-bent brass wire, 10 pairs of Magnalock brake lines, and you will not receive a gluing jig. You will need a gluing jig to install these brake lines onto your cars, so if you do not have a gluing jig yet, you should buy the beginner's pack before you buy the standard pack. Here's a few supplies and tools that we'll need to gather up before we get started. Some toothpicks, side cutters, tweezers, razor blade, safety glasses, gel super glue, a jeweler's screwdriver to help you take off the trucks off your car, and a small weight. I'm just using a flywheel off the locomotive. You could use a couple nuts glued together that are about the same size, and a piece of track that is about 4 inches longer than the car that you are working on. Before I continue on showing you the 3 different ways of attaching these to the rail cars, let's go over the differences between the old brake lines and the new brake lines. Here we have a sample of the old brake line that has a square magnet with a red dot on it and a little white piece of plastic at the end of it. And the new one here, that's just a cylindrical magnet that's been pre-weathered to like a dirty gray color. This one doesn't have any color markings on it, so you don't have to paint them or touch them up after, compared to this one where you'd have to repaint it because there's a red dot and it's kind of a shiny silver. Also, the new ones come pre-cut to 3/8 of an inch, so you don't have to cut them anymore. Right out of the package, they're ready to go, compared to the old ones where you had to pre-cut them to 3/8 of an inch, so saved you a couple steps there. Now we're going to check to make sure the coupler is set at the correct height according to the NMRA standard S2 coupler height guide. If the coupler is too low with our new gluing jig, we may accidentally glue our brake line a little bit too high on the coupler box. If we glue it too high on the coupler box, the brake line may interfere with the coupler, especially with lower shelf couplers. So it's very important that we glue the brake line in the correct position. Let's check the height of the coupler. Here I'm using a homemade jig, or you could use a pre-made jig from KD to measure the height of your coupler. According to the NMRA standards, the coupler should be 0.391 or 9.93 millimeters from the railhead to the center of the coupler, like you see in the picture. Now, before you measure the height of the coupler, make sure the coupler is sitting perfectly level in the coupler box. If it is drooping down, you may need to add some shims right about here. And if, let's say, the coupler is too low, you may need to add some shims between the truck and the bolster on the car. And if it's too high, which is a little bit more difficult to do, you may have to sand down the bolster on the car to bring the coupler to the right height. Go ahead and grab your gluing jig that came with the package. As you can see, it is made out of a solid piece of plastic. It also has a square magnet pre-glued in the correct position to it on the top of it. Also has a piece of plastic here to help the rubber air part of the brake line stay in the correct position while you glue it to your car. So let's grab a brake line and I'll show you how to place it onto our new gluing jig. So as you can see here that the new brake line doesn't have an alignment mark on it. So what do? No problem. The magnet on the gluing jig itself will align the brake line properly for you to glue it onto the car. So all you do is you go up to the magnet, place the brake line to it like so, and there you go. It's already automatically aligned in the correct angle and position to glue it onto the car. Taking your jig that we just placed our brake line onto is going to line it up to the end of the car and see where we need to run the air line to the brake line. As you can see, it lines up nicely right here at the end of the coupler box. So there's two ways you could run the air line. One is a straight piece of brass wire that leads to the end here, or using the pre-bent piece of brass wire running along the top and down to the end right here. Now, I suggest using the pre-bent piece of wire to run along the top and down. That just gives your wheels a little bit more room to move around curves. And here's another example on an Athearn Blue Box boxcar kit where you'll have to run the pre-bent brass air line along the top and down just past the coupler box cover so it lines up nicely with the end of the brake line right here. We'll go ahead and remove the trucks, the coupler, trimming the trip pin off the coupler, and remembering to wear safety glasses because those things will fly, and removing the original airline detail from the car. Continuing with our installation process, I have taken our pre-bent brass air lines and painted them black using Krylon ultra flat camouflage spray paint. I find it's a lot easier than breaking out your airbrush and having to do it that way, and also it's relatively inexpensive. Also, painting black, flat black, it's a lot easier than trying to match the color of the car, which you could also do too, but it's not necessary. So what we have to do now is trim the long side of the airline here to match the length of the coupler box here. So how we're going to do that is really simple. Just hold it up like that. Take your side nippers and just sort of hold it in place like that. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. As closer the better, but it's all right. There you go. So once it's cut like that, we're going to dab a few dabs of your super glue, gel glue just there, and we'll just glue it in place like so. So let's go ahead and do that. So just take your gel super glue and just put a little bit on the end of a toothpick. Not a lot, just a tiny bit. And just a little dab in the corner there, and one there. Oh, need a little bit more glue. Like so. And we'll grab our brass air line. So take your airline, we just trimmed to the right length. Make sure you got the right side. And just put it to the car. Now we'll just let it set up for a few minutes. Now we just have to trim off the excess piece here that's sticking up above the coupler box. Just cut it off flush with the coupler box like this with your side nippers. And now we're going to go ahead and put the trucks back on the car. I placed the trucks onto the car. I also placed a weight at the far end of the car so the car won't move while we're trying to glue the brake line onto the car. We're just going to place the jig up on top of the tracks, then we're going to place our weight up on top of the jig. The weight is there just to help steady the jig while we're gluing the brake line to the car. Now we could slide the jig up to the end of the rail car. As you can see, the brake line lines up nicely with the air line on the car. Let's say we accidentally cut the air line a little bit too short. Now the brake line doesn't line up with the end of the air line. You may be tempted to use shims under the rail and jig to raise up the jig so the brake line lines up nicely with the end of the air line. but be careful doing this. We do not want to raise it up too much, no more than 15 thousandths of an inch. If we raise it up any more than this, we run the risk of the brake line interfering with lower shelf couplers. So if you have to raise it up more than 15 thousandths of an inch, you may be better off re-gluing the air line a little bit lower, or gluing another one on and cutting it a little bit longer. And one more thing that we should check before we glue the brake line to the car is to make sure that the magnet of the brake line right here is in line with the center of the car. That's very important. Here's a diagram that shows you how they should look once you have installed them on the car. The left-hand side of the diagram shows you the correct way, where the magnets are in line with the center line of the car. On the right-hand side of the diagram, you noticed if the magnet is too far away from the center line of the car, they may not couple 100% of the time. Or if the magnet is crossing over the center of the line too much, they may not couple properly at all. So it's very important that you keep the magnets in the center line of the car, like on the left-hand side of the diagram. Making sure our coupler is centered in our car. Now we could go ahead and make our jig parallel with the end of the car, like so. And on some cars you may have to twist it a little bit to the left or the right to line up the magnet with the center line of the car. So it looks something like this. Now let's go ahead and glue it to the car. Let's add a dab of our gel super glue to the end of our brake line itself. Don't worry if you don't get enough on the first time. We could go over the joint later with a bit more super glue once we have attached it to the car. There you have it. So let's just let this set up for a few minutes and I'll be right back. The glue's set up on our car, so we just have to slide the jig away, and there you go, we're done. Now, before we go on to the second video, I'm going to show you how to install these on a locomotive. They're pretty much exactly the same as on a rail car, but there's a couple little differences that you need to know. So let's go ahead and I'll show you how to do it. Go ahead and grab your gluing jig. There's a couple of things you need to know before we get started. I don't recommend you using the jig how it sits right now to glue your brake lines to your locomotive. One is this red piece of plastic will interfere with the snowplow, not letting you get your brake line close enough to glue it into place where you need to. The second thing is that if you place a brake line onto your jig, like so, is that as you can see, the brake line angles to the right. On locomotives, I suggest having it come straight down. This is because the locomotives like to swing a lot when they go around curves, a lot more than cars. So they may become detached from one another when you go around like S curves and stuff like that. So I prefer just installing them straight up and down rather than on a slant. So how we're going to do this is we're going to grab this piece of straight metal, steel that came in your kit, and we're just going to glue it to the edge of your jig, which I have one already prepped here. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you how to line up your brake line on this metal piece, since it doesn't have any indicating marks on it. So let's go ahead and do that. Since it doesn't have an indicating mark on it, you just can't place it to your metal rod because you don't know which way it's supposed to go. The really simple way to do this is you attach it to your gluing jig like so, grab it by the end, pull your jig away, don't move your brake line, turn your jig and place your brake line onto the metal rod. Now it is aligned properly, so they'll all work together nicely. So let's go ahead and I'll show you how to test fit it on your locomotive. So we placed our jig on the tracks, and we'll place our weight up on top of the jig, and what we're going to do is just slide it into place. As you can see, it's a bit too steep of an angle, so we have to use our tweezers or a toothpick and knock it down a bit until it lines up with the snow plow or your air line leading to it properly. From the top view here, you could see what I'm trying to say when we prefer you to glue the brake lines on straight down rather than an angle from here to the center line of your locomotive. If you do it this way here, it gives you a bit more slack and they won't decouple on you going around sharp radiuses or S-curves. So this is the preferred method to do it on locomotives. You may get away with gluing them on an angle like this on small switchers, but you just have to see how your layout is and how well they work. But a foolproof way is to glue them onto your locomotive straight down rather than at an angle. And for reference, if you bring your air line from your locomotive just to the side of your coupler shank here, and that's where we want to glue the brake line to, right there. So let's go ahead and glue the brake line onto the locomotive. So just going to add a dab of glue to the end of the brake line. You could always add more later with the toothpicks and slide it up to your locomotive, making sure that it is aligned with the side of the coupler shank like we discussed earlier. Just like that. Now we'll just let the glue set up and we'll be right back. It's been a few minutes now and the glue has set up on our brake line on our locomotive, so let's go ahead and remove the jig from the locomotive. It's really easy. You just pull the jig away like so, lift it off the tracks, and there it is. It's really that simple to do. Once you get used to doing it, in no time you'll have your whole fleet done. So before we go on to our next car and our next way of installing them on a rail car, let's see how they work with the rail car we just finished off earlier on in the video. Isn't that nice? So let's continue on to our next video. See you there.